Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 125. This week's questions are taken from Guide 189 on the Daring class destroyers and from the Wednesday video on the architecture of dreadnoughts. Reaver asks, I'm trying to understand why the Squid replaced the Hedgehog. It seems like it was heavier and I'm not sure what the pros and cons resulting in it actually being superior were. Can you enlighten? There were two main items that meant Squid was seen as a superior option to Hedgehog. Firstly, Hedgehog was fixed. It pointed forward and you pointed the ship, you fired the Hedgehog, and that was that. Squid was a lot more manoeuvrable. It could be adjusted side to side, it could be adjusted front and back. In fact, some Squid launchers could actually be fired up and over the ship, so you could rear mount it but still have forward fire capability. So that made it a bit more flexible, a little bit quicker to respond. The other thing was that when you look at a Squid launcher, it has 3 tubes for these anti-submarine bombs, or depth charges, depending on what you want to call them, whereas Hedgehog has a lot more. Now, the thing with Hedgehog is that each of those individual charges is actually relatively small, so it needs to hit a submarine in order to kill it, which is fine as long as you do hit it, but even with World War II era submarines like the Type 7, you quite often would need more than one hit to actually finish a sub off, which was fine. You were firing quite a few, so there was a reasonable chance of that happening, but there was also a chance that you might only hit with 1 or 2 and damage the sub, or because it's contact fuse only, then you might miss, and even if you miss by half a metre, a miss is still a miss, and the submarine goes on completely fine. And presumably there's some very, very surprised deep-sea fish that get explosive Hedgehog rounds coming down on them, but that's probably somewhat beside the point. With Squid, each of the individual charges was considerably larger, so they could function much more like a standard depth charge, and they could be set right up until the point of launch with a varying depth of detonation. So with that much greater explosive charge and that ability to detonate at the height or depth, if you like, if that you wanted, it meant that you didn't have to hit an enemy submarine, you just had to be in the vicinity, and you were much more likely to catch them because now you had a blast radius instead of just direct contact. And this was very important because submarines were getting bigger, faster and tougher as the war went on, and that trend was only going to continue post-war. And so if you try to use a Hedgehog launcher against one of the early hunter-killer diesel-electric submarines, chances were you'd be very hard-pressed to hit it in the first place, and even if you did, you might score multiple hits and still only damage the thing, whereas a Squid round going off close by is probably still going to total or at the very least cripple a submarine. So it's effectively a response to the increasing durability and speed of submarines. Pretty much this, in a lot of ways, how the smaller, more rapid firing guns gradually became displaced by the heavier, fewer guns on battleships a few decades earlier, albeit that Squid didn't have a tremendously longer range than a Hedgehog, so the range wasn't so much the issue, it was more just the killing power. That range issue would be solved by the final iteration of Squid, which was quite helpfully known as Limbo, and that had a considerably greater range than either Hedgehog or early models of Squid, and so you had both extended range and extended killing power when it came to hunting enemy subs. JK asks, in the video on Dreadnought hull design, you mentioned that Dreadnoughts lasted through to 1945. But whenever you cover a battleship from the late 30s onwards, you never refer to them as any particular generation of Dreadnought or use the name Dreadnought at all. Why is this, and what differences in the ships cause the name to be Dreadnought to be dropped, if there is any reason? In an earlier Drydock, I did mention at least my version of the classification system of Dreadnoughts and pointed out that the use of the Dreadnought name kind of fell away in the late 1910s, early 1920s, because they basically gone from dreadnought to super dreadnought, and then as far as superlatives go, you couldn't really go much further than that without sounding particularly stupid. Within any kind of serious circle, dreadnought's fine, super dreadnought is fine, but like hyper super mega doom dreadnought just sounds like something a 6-year-old would come up with. And to be fair, I would kind of have liked to see some very straight-laced admirals trying to petition Parliament for the construction of the hyper mega super ultra uber doom dreadnought 9000, just to see what would have happened in Parliament on that particular date. But unfortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and that didn't happen at all. So there was also the blending, if you like, over the interwar period of the battleship and the battle cruiser. The battle cruiser started off as a cruiser killer. The battleship was, well, names, clues in the description really, but by the time you got to the as-designed Mackensen class dreadnoughts and obviously Hood, you were starting to see ships that were carrying about the same armament as battleships. They were just slightly faster, and in some cases slightly less well armoured, in other cases actually about as well armoured. You just got a much, much larger ship to pay for the speed. And whilst the battleship battle cruiser divide would have continued in the 1920s to varying degrees, by the time you got to the 1930s and new battleships were being built, they'd kind of blended the two concepts of speed and from the battle cruisers, as well as heavy armour and firepower from the battleships. And so you get things like the North Carolina, the King George V, the Richelieu, etc. And these are just called fast battleships, or as the Royal Navy sometimes like to call them, fully armoured battle cruisers. They're effectively just a single, now hybrid design. Then you get even faster battleships like the Iowa, but that's its own little thing. So effectively this new nomenclature comes in, but the ships are still fundamentally the evolution of the dreadnought, because bear in mind, one of the many advances in dreadnought was a higher speed than previous battleships. So the fact that they were just getting progressively faster doesn't preclude them from being dreadnoughts. They're just further along the developmental tree. Phineas DeCool asks about the Daring class. You mentioned that they steam at around 30 knots. That seems rather slow for a destroyer, or could they go a little bit faster if pushed? Overall, after World War II, the speed of destroyers seemed to drop. Is that true? And if so, why? It comes down to the old balance of speed, protection and firepower. Now, obviously, in terms of armour, destroyers aren't exactly famed for having massive amounts of protection. So it's really down to speed and firepower for a given hull size. And if you compare a destroyer at the beginning of the war, it would be expected to have a fire control system for its main guns, and that's about it as far as systems go. Other than that, it's got its main guns, it's got its torpedo launchers, and that's all you have to account for. So in terms of top weight and also power demands, you can shove an awful lot of engine in there to get it up to high speed. And of course, one of their primary roles is attacking an enemy fleet, for which they need a lot of high speed, and that's going to be done with the torpedoes mostly. And they've got to counter enemy ships that are doing the same, so you kind of get this race higher and higher in terms of speed. Now, post-war, and as you go through into the areas where I don't really look at too much, the amount of firepower and the systems to support that have massively increased. So whilst the individual number of guns might not have increased, Daring or Gearing, for example, having 6 guns, okay, that's slightly more than the 4 or 5 pre-war, but not too much. But the weight of the mounts has gone up. They've now got to deal with having radar, which is both a power demand and a weight demand, and multiple types, because you've got to have search radar, fire control radar, air search radar, anti-air control radar. You've got a lot more anti-aircraft weaponry, and obviously all of their associated control systems. And for a good chunk of time, you've also got torpedoes still, and obviously later supplanted by missiles, whilst the hull size doesn't really grow all that much compared to the massive increase in systems and firepower that destroyers are expected to carry. At which point, you just physically can't fit the same kind of power plant that you would have in earlier ships on a proportional volume basis. And without the need to send such vessels dashing into the enemy fleet to deliver torpedo attacks at point-blank range, that extremely high power demand you need to get those extra few knots to hit 35, 37 knots or whatever, the need's not there, and you can massively scale back the volume of the power plant if you're quote-unquote only aiming for 30 to 32 knots, at which point you can fit a lot more other systems in, like the aforementioned radar, sonar, guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and later missiles. As for the daring speed in particular, oh boy, the number of different sources that are available suggesting speeds of anything between 30 and 35 knots is quite considerable and varied, and I think I've seen literally every iteration between those two figures in half-knot speeds. So 30, 30.5, 31, 31.5, etc., etc. The solution seems to be, if I'm reading my Friedman's British Destroyers Second World War and After correctly, is that the Darings were designed for 34.5, 35 knots top speed in clean condition at standard loading, but once they were deep loaded and had been out at sea for a while, they could just about scrape over 30.5 knots. So I think that is basically the situation. Is some people have seen figures of the ship at absolute full load after it's been at sea for months. Others have seen figures for the ship running trials. Others have seen figures for the ships at typical operating speeds when they're partway between standard and deep loading, partway between fresh out of dock and been at sea for months. And this is where you get this multiplicity of figures from. So, yeah, the Darings could go a bit faster than 30 knots in certain conditions. And that's true for pretty much all destroyers. Rohan Benedict Tan asks, what is the blind fire system that you mentioned on the Daring class? So, the blind fire system on the Daring class was an evolution of a number of systems that had been developed in the US and British navies during the Second World War. And what it effectively allowed the Daring class to do was to engage multiple targets, both in the sea and in the air, without any reference to visual targeting, i.e. the radar systems and the fire control systems that read the data from them had advanced to a point where you could just fire on the basis of the radar returns and pretty much guarantee that you were going to hit or be very close to hitting. And this had been around for a while in World War II in certain circumstances, but with varying degrees of accuracy and also with varying degrees of size. One of the things with the Daring and a number of other post-war destroyers was that not only was the size of these very accurate blind fire systems scaled down to the point you could actually fit them on a destroyer. For example, the USS Johnston, as we know at the Battle of Samar, was able to use a form of blind fire system to engage targets whilst it was hidden in rain squalls. But you could also fit many of them on a Daring. So the Daring could engage multiple targets with independent weapon systems, all using radar and separate fire control systems. That was the kind of the big advance over some of the late war World War II destroyers. John M. asks, what was the logic for so many destroyers having a lower rear deck, lower centre of gravity? So the reason for this stepped approach to destroyer hulls in general is basically down to retaining stability and reducing displacement. If you look at the very earliest destroyers, sometimes people call them whalebacks, you can see they have a very rounded but very low forecastle. And that's because, again, for a destroyer you need to go fast. You don't particularly want to be seen if possible, so you want a low profile, reduced weight, etc. The problem is, in anything other than a mill pond, and if you're moving at the kinds of speeds that destroyers are capable of, sometimes even then, you're going to get massive amounts of water come over the bow. And there are two solutions to that. One is you can go for this whaleback option and let the water sluice off of you. But this only works up to certain sizes and certain speeds before you've effectively invented a semi-submersible. And also, obviously, all that water sluicing over you is going to be pressing you down. It's going to be exerting friction. It's going to be slowing you down in general, and that imposes a rather hard cap on you being able to accelerate past a certain speed without insane amounts of power, and also somewhat restricts your ability to actually do anything because you can't see your target nor fire because you're just being covered by a constant horizontal waterfall. And so the other way around it, which is what developed fairly rapidly, was to bring the bow up, raise the bow, and then now you cut through the water like a conventional ship. The bow wave goes either side of you instead of over you. The only problem with this then is if you have a continuous deck, a flush deck, you are now putting a lot more mass onto the ship, so you displace more, and also that weight, especially astern on the quarterdeck area, is higher, which impacts your stability. And so the happy medium that most destroyers found was a raised forecastle of varying lengths, and then it would drop back down and continue at the kind of height that was otherwise preferable for the destroyer for the rest of the length. One of the other factors you've got to bear in mind is that the higher up your torpedo launchers are, the more difficult it is to get a successful launch. A torpedo launcher that's actually quite close to the sea can launch its torpedoes much more easily than one where you're basically lobbing them off what might be a 15 to 20 foot cliff. So with all that in mind, that's why you get that kind of destroyer, but you are sacrificing overall volume, hull volume, which could be a factor. And you're also introducing a weak point where stress can build up, where the deck steps down. So this is why sometimes you'll see things like the flush deck destroyers, like the Clemson and Wicks class and some other classes later on, where effectively you're filling in that lowered quarter deck. Now, the one big marker of flush deck destroyers tends to be that, proportional to other destroyers of their period, they tend to be much larger, not just because of the extra displacement from adding basically an additional half a deck's length worth of structure, but also because to support that you end up having to make the destroyer dimensionally larger so that you can compensate for the effects on stability. So it's a bit of a trade-off. If you want smaller, faster to build - more economical destroyers, then you tend to go with this kind of approach with the step down quarterdeck. If you want to have the biggest, most powerful destroyers on the block, then you will tend to go for a flush deck approach. Mr. AWG9 asks, could the hull design for a modern-ish, say post-1940 warship, so bulbous flared bow, beam to length ratio, freeboard gunwale height, etc., have been translated practically into the age of sail warship design? Is there something inherent to timber and wood that required ships of that day to look a bit like washtubs, i.e. round and squat, when compared to modern warships? And was there a point in time where some naval architect just went, no, I'm changing everything? There are a couple of good reasons why ship design is so different in the classic age of sail as compared to 1940 onwards. One of which is the limitations of wood as a construction material when you are trying to build a ship that's actually going to move under its own power and go at any considerable speed. You can build a wooden ship far larger than a first-rate ship of the line if you're effectively building a gigantic barge and you're not particularly interested in it moving anywhere at any great velocity. But when you actually want it to be an active warship of some description, then you have to work with what you've got, and they say that there's an awful lot of structural limitations to wood. It's a very good material, but compared to iron and steel, once you get past a certain size and when you get to certain dimensional constraints, you have issues, and that particularly relates to length to beam ratio. The other issue with wood is that it floats generally, unless it's some of the really, really dense woods, and iron and steel don't, and that means, again, you're going to have a very different reaction from the hull when you put it in water. So you're going to, for a wooden ship, require it to actually be a lot more, as you can see with this diagram of Victory, have a lot fuller of a hull form underwater, because if you tried to build it with kind of a U-shape or V-shaped hull, chances are it's probably just going to flip itself onto one side or the other fairly quickly, which is not good when you're talking about large ships, obviously. Now, there are certain things that were addressed in the early 1800s by both Seppings and Simmons in the Royal Navy and various other designers who either came up with the similar ideas on their own or copied them in other navies, and that involves the second issue, which is framing. So wooden warship is built with framing, looks a bit like a set of ribs, and is often called ribs, and then you plank it up and put some cross beams going horizontally across the deck to support the decks themselves. But one of the major innovations that was introduced in the early 19th century was what might seem very simple to us today, is effectively cross beaming it along the sides of X-shaped beams, which vastly strengthen the overall hull frame, which allow for ships to be designed with very different hull dimensions. So if you look at an classic Age of Sail frigate, it in many ways resembles a slightly scaled down ship of the line when it comes to hull plan. When you look at a frigate from the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, not only have those advances in design allowed them to be physically larger, but they are also considerably longer for a given beam. And so when you look at something like Warrior is effectively one of the last generation Royal Navy wooden frigates, except built in iron. And when you look at the size and length to beam ratio of Warrior compared to Victory, you can see there's been a huge change. The bulbous stash flared bow is only really much of a help at higher speeds, so there's not really much point on putting it on anything from the Age of Sail. It would be an active detriment, because you're just adding more mass that doesn't really accomplish anything and might actually be even bad for it. And as far as freeboard height, etc. goes, well, unlike 1940s warships where you've got heavy turrets and really you want to try and bring your overall freeboard down as far as possible for stability purposes while still keeping it as high as possible for seakeeping purposes, on an Age of Sail ship all your guns are in the hull, so however many gun decks you've got, the hull has to accommodate that, and if that means it has to go high, then it goes high. Jet Driver asks, it seems the Royal Navy, especially compared to the US Navy, poorly maintained a number of their battleships during World War II. I've read somewhere that after one of the R-class ships went to the US for refit, she was in such poor shape and required so many resources that the US told the UK they would not refit another capital ship again. The Royal Navy, unlike the US Navy, does not seem to have modernised any of their older capital ships during the war, and it seems fair to say that nearly all or nearly all the older ships, Queen Elizabeth, R. Nelson, were completely worn out by the end of the war. Contrast that with the fully modernised members of the US Big Five, which were considered equal to new ships in nearly all respects except speed at the end of the war. Is it fair to say the Royal Navy did not maintain these ships well, and if so, why? If this was the case, did it apply to other ship types as well? I think that's a little bit unfair to the Royal Navy. The battleship you're thinking of is probably actually Rodney, which went in for refit for quite a while in mid to late 1941. And yeah, it arrived in a fairly poor state because, well, it had been due to head and was on its way to heading to the US for a refit, having got quite worn out at the time that Bismarck showed up. So by the time Rodney actually got over it, not only had it been at sea for several months longer than was anticipated, which obviously has its own effects on the ship, but it had also near enough torn apart large sections of its own machinery trying to get at Bismarck. So yeah, it was not in the best of shapes, and it did require a fair bit of effort. However, most of the issue for the US was that by late 1941 it was very clear that something was going to happen. They needed their shipyards for their own ships, and, well, after December 7th, they needed their shipyards for an awful lot of their own ships. At which point, the US quite fairly said, well, actually, we've got our own war concerns with our own fleet here, sorry, but US Navy ships have first priority in US yards. I mean, if you look at the amount of back and forth and argumentation that was required just to persuade the US to allow Richelieu to be refitted in a US dockyard, and Richelieu obviously is a fast, powerful treaty battleship, which would be a considerably stronger asset for the Allied navies than an R-class or even a QE. Now, as far as maintenance of ships during the war goes, again, there is some rather different circumstances. For a start, the Royal Navy went to war in late 1939 rather than effectively the beginning of 1942, which meant that their ships were run for almost 2.5 years longer. And then on top of that, because of Pearl Harbor, most of the older US ships ended up having to go into Drydock for major repairs, during which time they were modernised because, well, it would take about the same amount of time, which most Royal Navy ships obviously didn't take that kind of a battering, or if they did, in the case of something like Barham, they weren't taking that kind of battering in shallow water, so that there wasn't any chance of bringing them back. Now, past that, you've also got to take into account that the three of the Queen Elizabeth class, Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant plus Renown, were all modernised to the same kind of extent that a number of the US battleships post Pearl Harbor were, except that modernisation occurred immediately before World War II, so there wasn't much point in modernising them again and taking them out of action. Plus, because of that extra time spent at war and the fact that Britain was fighting for a lot of that time pretty much alone, and even after the US got involved in the war, the Royal Navy was still almost exclusively dealing with the Mediterranean, was dealing exclusively with the Indian Ocean, and mostly exclusively, at least in terms of capital ships, was dealing with the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans. There were demands all over the place for their ships, and to take a battleship into dock and completely modernise it, which the Royal Navy did want to do for a number of the ships, like Hood, Nelson and Rodney, for example, and the other two Queen Elizabeths, that process takes quite a long time, at least 1.5 to 2 years or more, depending on exactly how much work you're doing. The Royal Navy just flat out couldn't afford to have a capital ship offline for that amount of time, and so they couldn't bring them in for refit. As I said, there's two factors with the US capital ships, one of which is a lot of them are in there because of the damage they took at Pearl Harbor. You don't have a choice in that matter, so you might as well do the absolute best job you can while you're forced to have them in dock. The other thing is that for a long period, whilst the US was involved in the Second World War, they just didn't have the logistical training in terms of fast fleet oilers to support battleships out in the Pacific and elsewhere. That's why you see, for example, North Carolina and Washington actually show up quite a bit, as well as some of the South Dakotas. They show up quite a bit in the Atlantic and in the North Sea and the Arctic, because in those locations they're relying on the British logistical support chain for the most part. Out in the Pacific, they have to rely on fast fleet oilers because of the sheer distances between their operational areas and Pearl Harbor, and that's why you just flat out don't see battleships. It's a carrier, cruiser, destroyer game and submarines for a long period during 1942, and then as battleships start to show up, they tend to be the more modern, faster, more fuel efficient ships that are just being completed. So that's why you have North Carolina obviously then getting torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. You have South Dakota and Washington taking on Hiroshima. And so during all of this period, the US just can't deploy the older ships. So even some of the older ships that have not been quite as badly damaged, such as Tennessee or Maryland, they're still getting overhauls and refits because there's nothing else to do with them. They can sail up and down the US coast wearing out their machinery, but the US is pretty aware that the Japanese aren't coming for the West Coast in any large numbers, and they know how bad the air threat is over on the other side of the Pacific, so you might as well use your shipyard capability to upgrade your ships as best you can. And so when these modernized US battleships head out, mostly towards the end of 43, early 44, they've only got a year and a half, maybe 2 years of actual active war service to go, although they don't know that at the time. Whereas by that point, the Royal Navy and the Royal Navy's battleships have been at war for about 3 to 3.5 years already, and there's not really much let up for them. So they have the opportunity for quick refits, and where necessary, but they just do not have the time to do the full-on modernizations, and they're not forced to by massive damage that's recoverable, because they don't have a Pearl Harbor style incident. About the closest they get to it is when the Italians semi-sink Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in Alexandria Harbor, but Queen Elizabeth and Valiant are 2 of the 4 already modernized ships, so apart from adding even more light anti-aircraft weaponry to them, there's not a tremendous amount else worth doing. And the other thing you've got to also bear in mind is that the Royal Navy was looking at the war starting in 42, somewhere between 42 and 44. So one of the reasons the R-class hadn't had much, if any, attention by the start of the war was because they were supposed to be being replaced by the King George V's, and so they were expecting to just be able to pension them off as the full King George V class came into play, and then the Lions would have helped also to displace the last R's and the early Queen Elizabeths. But obviously that part didn't happen. Now, when you take that into consideration, so the R's are pretty much almost at the end of their service lives going into World War One, or World War Two even, then they get very heavily worn and used in the first few years of war. Some of them get damaged and patched back up again. But by the middle of World War Two, maybe 42, 43-ish, they've basically reached the end of their service lives, which is exactly what the Royal Navy was expecting to happen. And in fact, the fact they lasted that long is actually a mark for them in terms of being good build quality, because obviously wartime service takes a lot more out of them than in peacetime service. But when the Royal Navy is looking at the situation in, say, mid to late 1943, what's the point of refitting an R? The Kriegsmarine is down to, at that point, 2 capital ships, Scharnhorst and Tirpitz. They've got plenty of more modern capital ships to deal with that particular threat. The Italians have bowed out of the war, so there's no call for large numbers of highly modern battleships running around the Mediterranean. And the only other remaining navy that's against them with any significant capital ship strength is the Japanese Navy, and they know that the Japanese are mostly relying on the Kongos, the Nagatos, and of course the Yamatos, and they know that all those ships are much faster than an R-class is ever going to be, and in the case of Nagato and Yamato, also more heavily armed. So again, there's precious little point on spending a vast fortune fully modernising the old R-class, or indeed HMS Malaya, because, to be perfectly honest, by the time they succeeded in doing so, it would have been the end of the war anyway, and even if it wasn't, even a fully modernised R-class is not going to be isn't going to stand much of a chance facing up to some of the more modern Japanese capital ships. So it's just not worth it. And for shore bombardment, well, as I say, the RN's already got quite a few capital ships to do that job at that point anyway. Steve Valley asks, at what point were a battleship's turbines and boilers typically installed? The Battleship Builders says that the power plant was installed during fitting out, so the hull would be lighter at launch. But the wiki entry on North Carolina shows boilers being installed in the ship on January 1939, whilst the ship was launched in June 1940. And I've seen an aerial photo of Washington being launched, which shows the midships decked over, implying the power plant had already been installed. What was the usual sequence of power plant installation on a battleship, before or after launch? You could do either, and the book The Battleship Builders is correct in that most battleships would have their machinery installed during the fitting out stage after launch, in part because, yeah, it made the hull considerably lighter when it came to launching it, which made calculations a lot easier, but also because, generally speaking, although not all the time, the people who were building the hull were not the same people as were building the engines or the boilers. So if you wanted to install them whilst the ship was under construction in the slipway, you would have to, either you or whoever's building it would have to pay to have the engines and the boilers brought in by another ship to the slipway and then installed. And not all slipways had the machinery to the cranes and such like to bring and install engines and boilers. A lot of the very biggest cranes in the early part of the 20th century are actually in the fitting out basins, because that's where you put the turrets and the guns and things like that on. But regardless, there were some instances where boilers and engines would be fitted whilst the ship was still on the stocks, as it were, and that would then, as you said, allow the midships area to be plated over, which would mean that the fitting out process could be a bit quicker. If you look on page 117 of the Battleship Builders, you'll notice that it has a picture there of HMS Furious having one of its boilers installed, because that was another ship that was installed with most of its power plant in place at the time of launch. So yeah, the short answer is it varies. The medium answer, it varies to a degree, but most ships would receive their power plants after launch. And then the long answer is pretty much what we've just said, with the additional caveat that obviously as ships get bigger and technology gets more advanced, the ability to install the engines during the construction process instead of afterwards becomes somewhat more critical, because there's a lot more decks involved between the engine and the upper deck of a ship, but also just the cranes, etc. They're there, so you might as well do it. And especially as you go further and further through history, you start to see more and more ships floated out rather than launched, and the stresses floating out a ship are somewhat different and somewhat kinder than they are from effectively catapulting a ship on an angle from dry land into the water. And so that combination of factors makes installing the engines whilst a ship is under construction a lot more common these days than it was in the early part of the 20th century. Harrison White asks, do shells that fall short simply splash and explode, causing no damage, or do they somewhat break the water's surface and hit the ship? If so, how far could they travel, impact or penetrate? What's the potential factors for this to happen? Does gun size play a part, range, angle, and so forth? In other words, could you talk about this? So, if a shell hits the water short of its target, a few things happen. Well, one is it's hitting water at high velocity. If any of you have had the misfortune to fall into water, such as a swimming pool or something, from any significant height, and you weren't shaped very, very nicely to enter the water, you will know that water can hurt a lot. And yeah, you're not going at anything like the speed that a battleship shell is going at, so the material difference between hitting water and hitting concrete at that kind of speed is relatively slim. Obviously water does give way a little bit more, but still. So what will happen first is the windshield, the pointy nose bit of the shell, will break off. Near enough, certainly. The next thing that will happen almost immediately after that is that the shock of the impact will activate the fuse in the shell, which is generally at the base. And now you are on a limited time span, because at some point that shell is now going to explode, in theory. If the fuse doesn't work for whatever reason, the shell actually tends to follow a parabolic curve. So it'll enter the water and it'll dive for a bit, but it will actually tend to curve back up again. So if it was completely inert, assuming it retained enough energy to do so, it would actually eventually pop back out of the water. Generally, they tend to lose energy and or explode before they can do that, but that's a different matter. Now, the reason I say it might explode is because fuses are relatively robust mechanisms, but they're robust when in the manner that they're designed to be operated in, i.e. shell hits object and starts decelerating very violently. And this is mainly talking obviously about armor-piercing shells. High explosive shells pretty much designed to detonate on contact, they probably will. But with an armor-piercing shell, if it's a Japanese diving shell, like the profile you can see here, you'll notice it actually has a blunter nose, a much blunter nose than the average armor-piercing shell once you take the wind cap off. Now, that is a specific feature of diving shells, because it turns out that actually a very, very, very pointy nose is an awful idea for travelling at high speed underwater. That's why when you look at very early whitehead torpedoes, they're pointy, because you think, oh yes, pointy thing go through water very easily. Turns out actually no, when you're moving any kind of significant speed, a blunter nose is much better. That's why modern torpedoes have very blunt noses, not spiky ones. So a diving shell will keep on going, and then at some point, as obviously it's violently decelerating because of the density of water, at some point the fuse will run out and the shell will explode. So diving shells would tend to have their fuses set slightly long, because obviously the shell's not going to be travelling as fast through the water as it would through air, and then it hits the ship. Now, if it hits the ship with enough force, enough energy left, then it will penetrate, and the idea of a diving shell is that it will duck underneath the ship's belt, hopefully, where there's a lot less metal to get in the way. So even if it strikes at a speed and with a force that wouldn't necessarily penetrate the main belt, if it's ducked under the belt, it doesn't matter so much, and it'll go through and cause a lot of havoc. And because it'll be a detonation well below the waterline of the ship, it will cause a lot more damage than a shell that goes in like halfway between the waterline and the upper deck and just creates a new air pocket. Now, if it's not one of these types of shells, if it's a more standard shell, it might, I stress might, keep going, but it's probably, with a standard setting fuse, it's probably going to detonate relatively quickly. If, however, it doesn't go in a straight line, which is very possible, it will start to oscillate and it will tumble until it reaches a point where it's the optimum hydrodynamic form for that projectile, which is probably actually going to be base first. The problem with that motion is that that tumble very often can completely wreck a fuse, and this is actually what happened, as far as anyone can tell, with Prince of Wales, which took a hit rather deep underwater from a shell that fell short from Bismarck. Shell went into water, shell hit water, fuse initiated. Shell was not designed for travelling underwater. Shell flipped over backwards and hit Prince of Wales whilst travelling backwards, fetched up rather deep in the ship. However, that flip over motion that allowed it to continue through the water also destroyed the ability of the fuse to function and put the fuse out, so it was inert and a dud when it hit and penetrated Prince of Wales. Given the angle of descent and the distance it would have had to have been in order to accomplish what it did, if it had hit the water and the fuse had actually functioned, it would have detonated well short of the ship. So if you're talking about conventional shells, a hit that lands just short, yeah, that is still a threat to a ship, but a shell that lands 10, 15, 20 meters short or more, it's probably either going to explode away from the ship somewhere in the water, or it's going to lose energy to a point that if it does contact the ship's hull, it's not going to do all that much damage, or it might explode near the ship's hull, but at that point it's a very weak form of distance detonating torpedo or mine, and ship's anti-torpedo protection will probably absorb the impact no problem, apart from maybe a few splinters, or it's just going to flip over end over end and ruin itself and hit you as a dud. MG asks, funnels, they're always there, but no one really talks about them. Are they really just a simple pipe carrying air and smoke, or was there some technological advance behind the scenes? Also, how much of funnels a structural weakness when it comes to resistance to air attacks? So from a purely practical engineering perspective on a warship, a funnel actually serves a number of purposes. The most obvious is to carry all the filthy smoke and exhaust fumes away from lots of things that shouldn't have filthy smoke and exhaust fumes poured all over them, including, hopefully, if you've got the order of mast and funnel the right way around, the people in the spotting tops. Although that didn't always work out. But anyway, there's also a matter of making sure that the exhausts from the ship are properly vented. And for that, you've got to work out how much exhaust are the boilers producing, and how, in terms of volume of airflow. And then you've got to work out the cross-sectional area of the funnel that's needed to vent that. Obviously, if you have a funnel that's too small, you can't vent all the exhaust gases. The exhaust gases will build up in the boiler, pressure builds up in the boiler, and if you're lucky, efficiency will drop off. If you're unlucky, worse things can happen. If you have the boilers far too large, then you will... Well, it's just very big and heavy and pointless, takes up a lot of deck space, but a funnel that's far too large can also have some rather negative effects on the ability of your engine to operate at peak efficiency. But assuming you got it somewhat correct, boilers on steam vessels also serve another purpose, which is that the height of the funnel, and bear in mind the funnel goes below the deck as well, will affect the amount of convection draft that is present at the boilers. So the taller the funnel, the further and higher the exhausts go before they're released into the general environment, and so the bigger the draw is going to be on your boilers. So that will, again, this improves the efficiency of the engine. So if you have very tall funnels, it's very efficient, but that has problems with being spotted, stability, etc., and weight, etc. So there's always a bit of a compromise between the height of the funnel and all those other factors. This is one of the reasons, for example, that when Warspite hits Giulio Cesare at one of the many battles that the Royal Navy and the Italians fought, the one noted as being sort of the joint longest range hit on a moving target in history, one of the things that happens to Cesare is her speed drops off, because there's a hole near the base of the funnel, and so the convection draw through the engines is suddenly massively reduced by pretty much the exterior height of the funnel, and so she's not able to generate quite as much power as she was previously. There's also obviously factors about aerodynamics, because of the funnel's fairly large. It provides a certain amount of wind resistance, so if you can have fewer funnels, you trunk them together, if you can make them more aerodynamic, there's all technological issues there. But as far as structural weakness when it comes to air attack, initially, the way funnels were initially built, yes, they are a weakness, because in theory you could drop a bomb straight down into the boilers, and that doesn't tend to end very well. However, by World War II, once air threats are seriously a thing, you tend to find that a number of capital ships will have some form of safety measure built in some manner. So sometimes unintentional, sometimes it is intentional. The intentional ones usually took the form of armoured grates. So it's not quite an armoured deck, because obviously an armoured deck would block all the exhaust from coming out. But an armoured grate of a similar thickness, maybe even thicker than what you'd find in the armoured deck around it, would serve a similar purpose to the armoured deck of either just resisting the bomb or at least forcing it to begin detonation much higher up. Now you might think, if it just resists the bomb, well, the bomb explodes and stuff still goes down the funnel. Yes, that's true, but that's a lot better than the bomb going down the funnel, put it that way. And when you get to things like aircraft carriers, you actually have a sort of inbuilt feature, because the boilers are obviously towards the centre of the ship. The funnel, if indeed it has one rather than just an exhaust, will be off to the side of a ship, which means the funnel has to angle up, then outwards, and then up again. So if you were able to drop a bomb down the funnel of an aircraft carrier on, say, the starboard side, most of them have the island on the starboard side, then the bomb will drop down, and then it will hit the relatively light casing of the funnel as it curves away, and should probably just go through it and then detonate somewhere either to the side of the ship or in the side of the ship, which isn't brilliant, but it's better than detonating in the boilers. The flip side to that is that obviously if a bomb punches through the deck of the ship and it's an aircraft carrier, it can meet up with the funnel on its way down as the funnel curves back in towards the centre of the ship, and then either has an easier passage down, or when it detonates the fragments have an easier passage down to the boilers, and that's actually what happened to Yorktown at the Battle of Coral Sea. Maximilian Hubert asks, in hindsight, knowing what actual British forces were on the scene, how would you assess Captain Langsdorff's decision to scuttle Admiral Graf Spee in Montevideo? His actions and biography have been the subject of much interpretation ever since, and I recall the biography assessing his person has been released last year. To be honest, I think Langsdorff probably made the right decision, because when you look at Graf Spee's condition, yes, she still had some 11-inch ammunition left, and yes, she was combat capable, but if you look at the forces arrayed against her, by the time Graf Spee would have been able to turn around and leave later the same day that she'd slipped into Montevideo, HMS Cumberland had arrived, and Cumberland was a county-class cruiser, so kind of the bigger brother, albeit, literally the bigger brother of the Exeter. And given that Graf Spee had taken some damage fighting Exeter, Ajax and Achilles, Ajax and Achilles were still there, still combat capable, although obviously somewhat low on shells, same as Graf Spee was. Cumberland was fresh, it had an additional pair of 8-inch guns, it was bigger than Exeter and slightly better protected, so could take a bit more damage. So Graf Spee would be facing slightly worse odds than the battle that had forced it to run for Montevideo in the first place. And on top of that, it didn't have its diesel fuel treatment plant operational. That had been knocked out. It didn't have its galley operational. That had been knocked out. It didn't have its desalination facilities operational, so no fresh water other than what was on board at the time that it would have left. So even if Graf Spee had sailed out and managed to fight its way past the British forces that were present, which is by no means a guaranteed thing, it would have taken a fair bit of additional damage, and it probably would not have had the capability of actually reaching anywhere significant. Certainly wouldn't have been able to make the run home. It would have run out of fuel, food and water on the way. So getting back to Germany is not an option. About the only thing you could hope for Graf Spee would have been to make a break south for Buenos Aires and be interned in Argentina rather than kicked out of Montevideo. But even then, that's a short journey. Graf Spee certainly could have made that run, but it would have had to, as I say, make that run past the 3 British cruisers who were waiting for it. And given they were waiting at the 3-mile limit, they would have been able to draw a bead on the ship with torpedoes pretty much from the moment it emerged, and Graf Spee would have probably just run straight out of the 3-mile limit straight into a bunch of torpedoes. Assuming it managed to dodge those, it would have, as I say, come under fire from the 3 cruisers, including Cumberland. There would have been a lot of casualties, a lot of damage, and if by some miracle it makes it into Buenos Aires, Langsdorff is going to be in, as far as his usefulness to the war effort is concerned, exactly the same situation, i.e. he's not going anywhere, except that he would have got a bunch of his crew killed, and it's relatively unlikely that he would have been able to take down one of the British cruisers, considering that, well, he didn't manage to when there was Exeter instead of Cumberland, and Graf Spee was in considerably better shape that time round. So yeah, scuttling the Graf Spee didn't materially affect the outcome of any potential engagement as far as Graf Spee's overall effectiveness to the war effort was concerned, and it saved a lot more of his crew than a somewhat pointless, possibly just about successful running fight to Buenos Aires would have done. Matthew Jones asks, in general, which navies prioritise torpedoes on their destroyers the most, and which prioritised gunpowder on their destroyers the most? To simplify, let's take World War I and World War II as our time periods in question. In World War II, the navy that was probably most obsessed with torpedoes on their destroyers was, by some margin, the Japanese. They went in for quite a number of torpedo launchers, and they were the only ones to go on with fully designed reload systems and onboard reloads. Pretty much everyone else, whilst there was a theoretical capability to carry and use reloads, it was very much an ad hoc system, pretty much at captain's discretion. So yeah, torpedoes, big way, Japanese Navy in World War II. Gunpowder in the Navy, in various navies in the World War II period, is a very interesting question. Theoretically, one would be tempted to point to the tribal class and say the Royal Navy, because the tribal class, well, they had their origins in a small cruiser design, but then you've also got some of the Italian very small cruisers dash very large destroyers, and the French very large destroyers, and the German attempts to copy the French very large destroyers. The tribals still generally win out in terms of number of guns, but not in size of guns, certainly. And then if you're talking about the entirety of World War II, you've also got things like some of the US flotilla leaders that came in during the late 30s, which also have 8 guns, 5-inch 38s in their case. And towards the end, obviously, you have things like the Gearings, which, although they have 6, they have the improved dual-purpose ones, which some of the 8-gun US destroyers don't have. So yeah, it's a little bit difficult to judge who went the most gun on their destroyers. If you want to talk about the balance of firepower in guns versus torpedoes, probably the Royal Navy with the tribals, because they went down to a single set of torpedo tubes in exchange for having the 8 guns. But as I say, there's a lot of different navies with a lot of very heavy or very numerous guns in World War II. In World War I, again, pointing to the torpedo-obsessed people is slightly easier. In terms of the big navies of World War I, you're pretty much looking at the Germans, because the Germans, they're still officially calling most of their destroyers torpedo boats, and they are mostly, to be fair, designed as torpedo boats first, and the guns are just very, very distant second. As far as gunboats are concerned, well, if you want to slightly stretch the definition of the World War I time period, the US probably takes the hat in World War I, with the Clemsons and Wickses right at the end of World War I. But again, when it comes to the general World War I period, there's a whole slew of designs across the board from a lot of different navies that tend to have somewhat greater emphasis on gunpowder than the emphasis the Germans put on in their torpedo boats for torpedoes. So yeah, it's much, much easier to point to the people who are really, really into the torpedo warfare than it is to point to any one particular nation that was really into gun warfare, because realistically no one in either war spent their entire design lineage of destroyers focusing primarily on gunpowder. Different navies at different times would have certain classes or types that focused on gunpowder, but they would be balanced out with other more balanced or more torpedo-heavy designs. Jonathan Smith asks, I read a paper a while ago about the Royal Navy's transition from coal to oil. It also covered something I hadn't previously heard of, patent fuel, coal briquettes, assembled from small fragments of coal along with bindings and various other materials. Apparently one benefit was longer storage life than coal before degrading, especially in hot or humid climates, up to 5 years for the ones the Admiralty settled on. How serious a practical problem was coal deteriorating whilst in storage? Did other navies also experiment with such factory-assembled solid fuel for their coal-fired boilers, whether for the fuel storage stability or just to improve their fuel quality? Coal deteriorating in storage was a problem, but it depended, as you might guess from what your question contained, depended on whereabouts you were based. If you were based in somewhere relatively cold or even temperate, it wasn't anywhere near as much of a problem as if you were closer to the tropics. Now, beyond that, you've also got how long you're storing it there for, because if you are a small to medium-sized navy and you're mostly based in home ports, you can probably just order coal, sort of your coal consumption for that year, roughly speaking, and have that on hand. And if hostilities look like they're building up, you can build up a bit more stocks, so it's not too much of a problem. So most of those kind of navies didn't really bother too much. But if you have remote overseas bases a long way from home, which basically at the time of coal-powered ships means mostly Britain and France, with later on some smaller additions by Germany, America, etc., and of course Spain, then you need to start thinking about that a bit more, because you're going to have mostly warmer areas, so the coal's going to degrade faster. You're going to have to ship it there, so the sort of the timer starts to a certain degree from the point you're shipping it. And then once it's there, because you're basing small squadrons or even individual ships rather than an entire fleet, but you might be basing a larger fleet or squadron out there at short notice, you don't know, so your coal stocks are always going to be fairly significantly over the average consumption of the average number of ships there, which means that individual amounts of coal are probably going to be hanging around a lot longer, and that in turn means that there's a much greater chance of them degrading. So yeah, the only people who are really going to be concerned about it in a big way are going to be Britain, France, and then once they've got the Philippines, to a certain extent, America. But to be perfectly honest, it's mostly Britain, followed very distantly by France, just because of the sheer number of overseas possessions and overseas bases that the Royal Navy has as compared to practically everybody else. Now, obviously, as various nations expand their holdings and expand the size of their navies, this becomes more and more of a concern. But as that's happening, pretty much everyone switches over to oil anyway, and oil doesn't have quite as many problems as coal does, at least when it comes to that kind of storage degradation issue, and suddenly the problem is a lot less pronounced. Joe Pasquale asks, have you ever thought of having the pictures that you have blown up into posters and then selling them for those of us who want them? I'm completely unopposed to the idea. If there are photos on the website, obviously drachinifel.co.uk, if there are photos on there that people would like to have as posters, then I'm perfectly happy to arrange that for them. The only caveat I put on that is that when I obviously do a big batch of posters, like with the Fleet Aeron ones or the Thunderchild ones, I am able to order those in bulk, and if where possible take advantage of any offers that the printing company might have on, which in turn means that I can get them to you for hopefully a fairly reasonable price. If I'm effectively doing a kind of print on demand kind of thing, again, yeah, not a problem at all, but it does mean the cost of an individual poster will be somewhat higher, and it also means that I'm probably going to have to, because then there's also a cost for them to ship them to me before I ship them out. So in order for that shipping cost to kind of disappear, I would have to order a number of different posters at once. So and obviously they've got to print them, they've got to send them to me, and then I've got to send them to you. So there would be a bit more lead time involved. So I don't know how popular the service would be. I mean, if there were half a dozen orders coming in per week, then I could probably say, okay, well, at the end of the week, I'll order these half dozen posters. They'll probably take a week to come, and then I ship them out. So from the time of first order to receipt, assuming the postal service is working okay, at least within the UK, would probably be about 3 weeks, based on the time for various people receiving their posters in places like the US and elsewhere. There would be maybe a 4 to 5 week total delay between I want this poster and the poster arrives, unless of course I outsource it all to a print on demand service, but I'm loath to do that, mostly to be honest, because I can't then quality control them. And I mean, some of you out there for some reason want me to sign and put messages on these things, which I can't do if it's coming from a print on demand service. But as those of you who've bought the Thunderchild posters will know, where I have a choice of where these get printed, I try to use a silk laminated paper, which is much more durable, much more damage and waterproof, and much more tear resistant, and not prone to creases anywhere near as much as well. So I try to get you guys as high quality and durable a product as I can, whereas most, to be perfectly honest, print on demand services that I've used, you tend to get poster paper, which the quality of the print I tend to find is sometimes lacking, and very easy to scratch, crease, and tear. So I'd rather not go down that route if I can avoid it. Now, with that said, I am looking at the printer that I use at the moment to see if they can do a print on demand, and if they can, then obviously I can link people to that, because then I can preset this is the quality I want, obviously with the caveat that if it's done print on demand, then it will come to you as is. I won't be able to add anything to it there afterwards. But with all that said, if people are happy with that, and if you would be interested in that with those caveats, then please, probably not so much let me know in the comments, because that'll tend to clutter them and I may not see it. Maybe drop me a line via Discord or by email and let me know that you have some interest in that. And if there's enough interest, then I will quite happily do it. And if there's only a few of you out there who'd be interested, well then, to be honest, I'd still perfectly quite happily meet your needs as well. And I must apologise, actually, when I launched the website, I did have plans to scan in and upload new pictures roughly every week. I just have not had the time. But if you've listened to last week's Drydock, you'll know that probably in the new year I will have a lot more time on my hands. So and also I've got a bunch of time off over the Christmas period, so I will be aiming to update the website with a lot more pictures very soon. So yes, apologies for the slight delay on that, but we'll hopefully see a lot more a lot sooner. Not much channel admin this week, to be perfectly honest, as the week's been relatively quiet, other than knuckling down to make sure that enough videos are produced for the holiday season. The only thing really to mention is it seems there's a relatively good reception to the experimental Fun Friday video I put up, and so I think I'll continue that, although as I mentioned in the community post, it's going to be an irregular thing, kind of as and when I've got the time and I've got something that I think might be interesting for people to see. It's not going to be a every single week feature. And of course in the new year I will be updating the live list on the 5-minute guides to show what the next year is going to bring. Trust me, there's an awful lot of ships still on the list. Okay, well with that said, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video.